Dear Norman, I'm glad you feel satisfied with your life. No reason why you shouldn't. When I look back on mine, I think it's changed very little. Since leaving Oxford, I've worked in a library and tried to write in my spare time. For the last 16 years, I've lived in the same small flat, washing in the sink and not having central heating or double glazing or fitted carpets or the other things everyone has. And of course, I haven't any biblical things such as wife, children, house, land, cattle, sheep, etc. To me, I seem very much an outsider, yet I suppose 99% of people would say I'm very establishment and conventional. Funny, isn't it? Of course, I can't say I'm satisfied with it. Terrible waste of time.
Philip Larkin was one of Britain's greatest and best-loved poets, whose books are still bestsellers, enjoyed by thousands of readers. He affected people's lives by writing about the everyday world they knew in a language they understood, while somehow managing to transform the mundane into something magnificent. The poems are absolutely full of emotion and feeling, yet Larkin, who famously penned the line, "What will survive of us is love," made himself almost willfully unlovable. He was seen as a grumpy old bachelor and professional pessimist, and his verse is often preoccupied with sorrow and death. Subjects that not only inspired him, but coloured his entire life.
The Philip I knew was bleak and dark. He was insistent upon a completely negative worldview being the right one. He was absolutely insistent that there was no God, no future life, no hope for the planet.
It's no small thing to have been one of the great English poets of the century. But that was, like everything else, coloured by death. Being remembered as the poet he is, he would have said, it's going to be no bloody good to me, because I'll be in my grave.
They f*** you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were f***ed up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself.
Philip Larkin was born in Coventry in 1922. He was a shy child with bad eyesight and a stammer. He later described his early years as a forgotten boredom. Larkin's parents, Sidney and Eva, ran a gloomy household where little happened and hardly anyone visited, not even relatives. One of very few people who saw this claustrophobic scene at first hand was Larkin's first girlfriend, Ruth Sivens, who he met in Wellington, Shropshire, in 1943.
He invited me to go to have tea and meet his mother and father. I found a very repressive household. My memory of it is of darkness, and I don't know whether that was the windows or the mood. But we were neither of us at our best. Philip was terribly self-conscious about having me there, and it was immediately clear to me that Sidney Larkin was not impressed. I was straight away frightened and put off by him, and struck by the extreme nervousness of his mother, who was... it was rather like being, with the Barretts of Wimpole Street, I felt.
Sidney Larkin was an ambitious self-made man, rising from office junior to become Coventry's city treasurer. He was strict and cold with little time for life's niceties. Larkin later observed that his father ignored his mother and treated his sister Kitty as if she was subhuman. But he doted on his son and gained his respect despite all his fatherly shortcomings.
It was clear where Philip's admiration lay, and it was his father and his father's views, which, after all, lasted the whole of his life. He was incredibly right-wing, anti-democratic, all the things his father was.
Sidney Larkin wasn't just right-wing. He corresponded with Hitler's economics minister, Schacht, and was forced to remove a swastika from his office in Coventry, even after war had finally broken out. He took his son twice to Germany in the late 30s. Larkin blamed these trips on his renowned hatred of everything foreign. Sidney's strict authoritarian manner undoubtedly influenced Philip's adult life, but even more so, the browbeaten treatment doled out to his mother, Eva.
This is a caricature, but there is something about it which is floppy, whining, clinging, adhesive, demanding, because she is pitiable. So I think that we can say, without even looking very far away from saying those things themselves, that she's likely to have had a very strong influence on the way that he reacted with other women who were more or less his own age.
Philip Larkin described his mother as monotonous and self-pitying, recalling how she once leapt up from the dinner table and said she was off to commit suicide. He looked at his parents' marriage and thought it drab, loveless and hopeless. There was no way he was going to repeat this himself.
I was shocked by some of his views, and those were his views on love and marriage and children. I can remember sitting on top of a tram with him and him saying, "There's no such thing as true love, it's just deprivation and ignorance." And I think I was probably extremely shocked. And people only get married so their children can look after them in old age.
The Philip I knew was quite passionless. I do not believe that Philip was capable of loving anybody. If you love somebody, you have got to surrender part of yourself to that person. I don't think he was capable of doing it.
The difficult part of love is being selfish enough, is having the blind persistence to upset an existence just for your own sake. What cheek it must take. And then the unselfish side. How can you be satisfied putting someone else first so that you come off worst? My life is for me. As well, ignore gravity. Still, vicious or virtuous, love suits most of us. Only the bleeder found selfish this wrong way round is ever wholly rebuffed. And he can get stuffed.
Larkin did have one deep relationship that lasted his entire life. Admittedly, one that was simply platonic. While studying at Oxford University, he met someone else with ambitions as a writer, Kingsley Amis. They became friends in an instant, and it didn't take long for the young Larkin to realise he had found his soulmate.
It was a love at first sight that lasted till death. In all the accounts, they both felt that for the first time they'd encountered someone more brilliant than themselves. They both felt that. Funnier, more exuberantly bright than themselves.
Much of their rapport was through a lifetime of correspondence, which Amis himself described as sheer childishness. Their letters were sexist and adolescent, full of swearing, in-jokes and bitchy remarks, and always ending with the word bum. Amis shared much of Larkin's cynicism and disdain of life. These letters were an escape into their own private little world.
If there was a letter from Larkin, my father was, that marked a different kind of day than if there wasn't. More high spirits, more laughter, more joie de vivre.
Dear Kingsley, don't you think it's absolutely shameful that men have to pay for women without being allowed to shag the women afterwards as a matter of course? I do. Simply disgusting. It makes me angry. Everything about the relationship between men and women makes me angry. It's all a f***ing balls up. It might have been planned by the army or the Ministry of Food.
Men behaving badly wasn't in it. He wanted to impress Kingsley. Very much he wanted to impress Kingsley. And therefore, his behaviour became, I thought, quite unbearable when they were together.
And what would you do about it?
Nag, I suppose, in private. Do all the wrong things, anyway. Confirm Kingsley in his view of me as not worth his attention. And irritate Philip and make him feel both guilty and angry.
Ruth and Philip got engaged in 1947, but that didn't stop him calling her Miss Ruth and the school captain in his letters to Amos. Their relationship set a pattern that Larkin would repeat for the rest of his life, a phobia of being tied down.
It depended on whether he was in his I have got to get out of entanglements mood or not. When he was really feeling trapped, then he would be quite unkind, and it was certainly clear how there would be no real future as man and wife, even though I was still wearing his ring. And he didn't mind that. I mean, it kept things just ticking over as far as his options were open. But it just trailed off, which is exactly what you'd expect of Philip somehow. He wouldn't have liked a confrontation whereby I threw the ring back and we never saw each other again. It wasn't his way. He was aware of the power of his writing and that he had hopes of being a great writer, but things must not stand in his way, nor people either.
In 1955, Philip Larkin moved to the city that would be home for the rest of his life, Hull in North Yorkshire. It seemed an odd move for such an ambitious writer, with 2 novels, Jill and A Girl in Winter, already in the bookshops. Larkin rubbished Hull in his letters to friends, a frightful dump, chilly and smelling of fish. But in many ways, this bleak city on a remote corner of England made him the poet he was.
Hull was absolutely essential to him. It was a place of perfect expatriation. He made himself so much peculiarly, both at home there and at home there, somewhere from which he could feel in exile from the warm centre of things.
I never thought about Hull until I was here. Having got here, it suits me in many ways. It is a little on the edge of things. I think even its natives would say that. I rather like being on the edge of things. One doesn't really go anywhere by design, you know. You put in for jobs and move about.
Larkin hadn't been earning his living as a writer, but as a librarian, a career he fell into by accident, but which he liked and excelled at. After stints in small libraries in Shropshire and Belfast, his new job at the Hull University Library was a big step up the ladder. He liked the concentration and quiet that being a librarian gave him, but now he would be the boss of a large team.
To begin with, he was very nervous. He had quite a bad stammer when he first came to Hull. It was his first post as someone completely in authority, and I think he was nervous of us, and we were wary of him. We knew that he'd written a couple of novels, but we didn't know much about poetry at all, and we certainly didn't know that, he was in negotiation for the publication of The Less Deceived, which came out 6 months later.
Published in Hull in late 55, The Less Deceived was the real flowering of Larkin's mature poetic voice. The very first poem he wrote for the book, Going, summed up his signature style. Moving effortlessly from a descriptive beginning to a weighty conclusion, taking in Larkin's familiar observations of the world around him, while totally infused with sorrow and loss.
There is an evening coming in across the fields, one never seen before, that lights no lamps. Silken it seems at a distance, yet when it is drawn up over the knees and breast, it brings no comfort. Where has the tree gone that locked earth to the sky? What is under my hands that I cannot feel? What loads my hands down?
From the off, Larkin's poems were recognisable for their bleakness and hopelessness. He once wrote, "Depression is to me what daffodils were to Wordsworth," and the last lines of Going set the tone for not just his work, but his mindset. A prevailing mood of finality and death.
I find that when I come here on a wet Sunday afternoon in December or something like that, when it isn't at all romantic, it gets me into perspective, it gets my worries into perspective, and everything I write, I think, has the consciousness of approaching death in the background.
I think Larkin was of a particular type. There's probably a name for it, early death awareness syndrome or something. Most people aren't aware of death and in fact feel invulnerable to it until their 40s. In fact, thinking you're not going to die, that you're the clever exception, could be a definition of youth. And Larkin never had it. Terrified of death.
I couldn't believe that someone in his early 20s was so aware of death. He was very much aware that life was transient, that you had got to make the best of an inevitable end which led to nothing, oblivion.
The Less Deceived made Larkin's name. It was well reviewed and sold beyond anyone's expectations. But leaving Hull and going off to live it up in the literary world wasn't on the cards. Larkin was absolutely committed to being a librarian. It gave him a strange kind of satisfaction, and he would stay there for 30 years.
It forces you to think about something other than yourself, something other than your own poems, and that is positively good for you, I think, even as a poet. And secondly, of course, and the whole business releases you from that awful pressure that I imagine you must feel sometimes of just having to write something to carry on living.
His idea, actually, of life was probably one which he inherited from his father, which was of a fairly strict work ethic, but one which he could mock at the same time and see the ambivalence of. The toad work, in fact. That work was something which was a burden, and one got sick of it. But if one didn't have it, how was one going to spend the rest of one's time?
Why should I let the toad, work, squat on my life? Can't I use my wit as a pitchfork and drive the brute off? 6 days of the week it soils with its sickening poison, just for paying a few bills. That's out of proportion.
He thought a day job was absolutely necessary, and if you didn't have that, you would turn into some freakish parasite. When I went freelance, on my very first day of being a freelance writer, he turned up at my house just to make sure I wasn't swanning around like an old coward in a dressing gown with a cigarette holder and playing at being a writer. That was actually at my desk.
Philip Larkin had been at the Bryn Mawr Jones Library for 5 years, when, late in 1960, a junior librarian he'd been tutoring, Maeve Brennan, took him to dinner to thank him. Their professional relationship was about to become something much more.
We went to the Beverley Arms at Beverley, and we seemed to have quite a romantic evening. It was a very giddy evening. It was also extremely frosty and very treacherous underfoot. And for some reason or other, Philip didn't think of calling a taxi home from the hotel. We walked right through the town, and from that evening, things took a different turn. And, we were soon on the verge of falling in love. We were very happy in each other's company, and we behaved like teenagers in love for the first time. And it went on like that for quite a long time. I had a dress that he particularly liked, an evening dress, and he took a great number of photographs in the flat with me posing in this dress, which he called your My Fair Lady dress. We'd been to see the film My Fair Lady. We went at least twice, I think, and it captivated him, and he thought that I looked like Audrey Hepburn in this dress.
Larkin started his romance with Maeve, full knowing that it would complicate their lives dramatically. He already had a girlfriend, Monica Jones, a university lecturer in Leicester, 100 miles away. They may not have lived together, but their relationship went back nearly 10 years and was very intense.
I think that Monica had the mental equipment, the reading, the interest in Englishness, and the political alignments that were more sympathetic to him than any other person he met. She managed to keep him, in a sense, on his toes and to surprise him more than anybody else. And that made her especially lovable.
Monica Jones was sparky, opinionated and intelligent. At first, Larkin was intimidated by her. They got to know each other best and spent most time together on typically Larkin-esque holidays in remote, dismal places, the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man. Monica accepted Philip was a bit self-absorbed, but she couldn't have predicted how helpless he would become once there were two women competing for his attention.
Dear Monica, I was much relieved to get your letter this morning and to know you felt less distressed. I slept very badly last night thinking about it all. I don't take any credit for this, for really my thoughts were mostly selfish. I suppose dread of being forced into action. There isn't any need to make my situation any better sounding than it is. A self-centred person conducting an affair containing almost no responsibilities with one girl getting mixed up with another, heedless to the feelings of either. Well, not heedless, but not heedful enough to do anything about it anyway. I suppose one reason I don't find it easy to talk about it all is that it doesn't bear talking about if I'm to keep any self-respect. I also find it painful.
I worked with Philip. I saw him every day. And, I wasn't living with Philip or sleeping with him, so I don't know. I just thought, well, he's going to settle for one of us in the end, and I hoped it would be me.
I remember him saying, well, there's one woman I ought to marry, and there's another woman, and I love her, but she's a Catholic, and so there's no sex before marriage, although we come pretty close to it. And I don't know what to do. And I said, well, you should go where your heart dictates.
We used to have quarrels about Monica. She was always there. And really, for the 18 years of our relationship, it was a three-cornered relationship, I always felt Monica was like a sword of Damocles hanging over my head, if not Philip's as well.
For years to come, Larkin would keep both women ticking along, the relationship simply drifting in his usual fashion. He was incapable of committing to either, and was never fully able to confront within himself what he was up to.
Talking in bed ought to be easiest. Lying together there goes back so far. An emblem of two people being honest. Yet more and more time passes silently. Outside, the wind's incomplete unrest builds and disperses clouds about the sky, and dark towns heap up on the horizon. None of this cares for us. Nothing shows why, at this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind.
Philip Larkin was at his happiest during his Hull years. After all this time, he'd finally organised his life to suit him to perfection. For nearly 20 years he lived alone in a flat overlooking Pearson Park. This flat was his sanctuary. Almost all his poems were written there in the evenings after work, and he thrived on this bachelor life.
Thinking in terms of one is easily done. One room, one bed, one chair, one person there makes perfect sense. One set of wishes can be met. One coffin filled. But counting up to 2 is harder to do. For one must be denied before it's tried.
His life of oneness in Pearson Park gave rise to Larkin's greatest books, The Whitsun Weddings and High Windows. But to achieve this, he had to keep other people at a distance. They got in the way of his writing.
I think that he had carved out for himself the sort of life that he wanted and could cope with. And his excursions into other kinds of life, family life, were little moments of pleasure, but of a kind of pleasure that he didn't want to take part in for the rest of his life. They were holidays.
Dear Judy, Moral Leper will arrive King's Cross, 7:32, Eldon Road, circa 8. I shall most likely have had dinner, on train. I trust children will be chloroformed by then.
Real life, as everyone knew it, was Philip Larkin's subject. It was what he became famous for. But though the mundane rituals of ordinary life were what he wrote about, weddings, children, home, ironically, they were the things he himself wouldn't take part in. He was a voyeur, observing the world from a safe distance.
Summer is fading. The leaves fall in 1s and 2s from trees bordering the new recreation ground. In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble at swing and sandpit, setting free their children. Behind them, at intervals, stand husbands in skilled trades, an estate full of washing, and the albums, lettered Our Wedding, lying near the television. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school. And their children, so intent on finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. Their beauty has thickened. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives.
Content in his isolation, Larkin rarely left Hull. He was a highly established literary figure, but he didn't play up to this fame. It was an invasion of his highly guarded privacy. If he was seen as a rather ordinary, dour, grumbly man, the bard of the North, or, as he himself put it, a welfare state poet, that was fine. He didn't want to give too much of himself away.
Well, I think this business of this projection of himself as a person who did lead apparently a life of deliberated ordinariness, who was extraordinarily ordinary, it's a kind of mask, if you like, in the sense that it allows him to move around behind this configuration of things that he presents to the world and have deeper, stranger, quieter, or more vivid feelings in a protected state.
The truest part of Larkin was clearly in his poems, and he was most himself in his poems. And when he stepped out of his poems, he brought with him from inside that private life of his a consciousness that, you know, he was Larkin and he needed to be in some way Larkin-esque. And Larkin was always Larkin-esque. He was, at heart, Eeyore. He was the master of taking that sort of gloomy, ironic, Eeyore-ish relish in the popped balloon and the empty jar of honey. And if you brought Larkin a full jar of honey, he soon made it an empty one.
This gloominess wasn't just a pose. He seemed genuinely unable to appreciate success. Although Larkin's life was now running exactly to plan, it seemed as if nothing was ever quite good enough for him.
My dear Judy, sometimes I think I shall never leave Hull. I'm growing defeatist. I spurn offers to fly me to Montreal or Rome. Wonderful girls called Shirley and Beverly write asking what Mr. Bleaney is about, and I instruct Betty to reply, Mr. Larkin regrets. I'm not even turning into a regional poet with his clay pipe and acknowledged corner in the snug of the Cat and Fuddle. Just an anonymous figure whom people will dimly remember seeing when the evening paper says, Hull man dies.
There was one genuine source of exasperation for Larkin, one he couldn't control like everything else. He'd avoided the trappings of family life, but he couldn't avoid his mother Eva, long widowed and relentlessly dependent on him. He wrote to her constantly, usually about nothing much, often on twee animal postcards, but it was an obligation that tested his patience.
Well, you know what the phrenologist said about you when you were ever so young.
What? Being dropped on my head?
No, he said that it would be no use telling you what to do because you'd always go your own way. And he said he won't marry till late in life. And that looks totally true. Doesn't it?
Well, I'm late in life now.
Not all that late.
I don't know.
Men can marry any time.
Well, I don't know. I think, you know, 20 to 40 is what you might call the fillet steak of life. And you're getting onto the poorer cuts after that.
There's no question that he had a very, very developed sense of filial responsibility to her. And actually, in those practical terms, he was extremely good to her. He saw her at least every fortnight. If we want to talk about what's complicated and irritating to him about his relationship with his mother, it's because her weakness was a kind of strength. She just, as it were, lay there or sat there. And what was he to do? Walk away from her? He couldn't do that. So that did exasperate him, I think.
Maeve, dear, this is almost certainly the last letter I shall write as an under 40, so treasure it. Put it in a glass case like a British Railways ham sandwich. I haven't got round to writing to you before because I foolishly took my mother on a bus excursion into the Peak District which didn't end till nearly 10. God, I must never do such a mad thing again. It was boring, irritating hell. I'm only just emerging from the black fury into which it cast me.
Eva's neediness irritated Philip, but something else about her nagged away at him. Her health was gradually fading. The more frail she became, the more she was a reminder of the dread of ageing and mortality that plagued his mind.
We were sitting in this Lebanese restaurant in Hull, and I was quoting from him the famous lines in Dockery and Son. Life is first boredom, then fear. Whether or not we use it, it goes. And Larkin immediately jumped on me and said, "Oh, no. There's no boredom left for me, I am afraid. It's fear all the way."
What do they think has happened, the old fools, to make them like this? Do they somehow suppose it's more grown up when your mouth hangs open and drools, and you keep on pissing yourself, and can't remember who called this morning? Or that if they only chose, they could alter things back to when they danced all night, or went to their wedding, or sloped arms some September? Or do they fancy there's really been no change, and they've always behaved as if they were crippled or tight, or sat through days of thin, continuous dreaming, watching light move? If they don't, and they can't, it's strange. Why aren't they screaming?
The old fools. I remember being very horrified when I read that poem. But I didn't feel I could ask him, as I would have done in the past, why has your voice changed? Why has it gone so much harsher, so much more cynical?
Perhaps being old is having lighted rooms inside your head and people in them acting. People you know, yet can't quite name. Each looms like a deep loss restored, from known doors turning, setting down a lamp, smiling from a stare, extracting a known book from the shelves, or sometimes only the rooms themselves, chairs and a fire burning, the blown bush at the window, or the sun's faint friendliness on the wall some lonely, rain-ceased midsummer evening. That is where they live, not here and now, but where all happened once. This is why they give an air of baffled absence, trying to be there, yet being here.
After years of illness, Eva Larkin died in a nursing home in September 1977. It was the first in an intense series of events that would dramatically affect both Philip's work and his mood.
He became very depressed, melancholy. And I remember being quite horrified when he said one day, I drink half a bottle of sherry or more before coming to work, just to enable me to get to work. And, I think he was drinking during the day as well.
Aged only 55, Larkin would write very little poetry for the rest of his life. But his mother's death spurred him to finish one final masterpiece he'd been struggling with for 3 years. Obad, his definitive statement on the demon that had haunted him since childhood.
I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation. Yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify.
I do think that Obad is a kind of giant, terrifying, brilliant full stop. I'm sure that there are other things to say about death, and I'm sure that he would have agreed with that. But I think that it brought him to the end of a particular line of thought. Something happens to make the poems dry up. His apprehension of what made up life, of the kind of big building blocks in life, simply got so harrowingly clear that once he'd made his statements about the inevitability of death, the inevitability of decrepitude in old age. Once he'd said it, and that was that.
People's imaginations.
There was...
Larkin was, by all accounts, now feeling numb to life. With poetry all but behind him, his life spun out of control. He started a clandestine affair with a woman he called his loaf-haired secretary, Betty McGrath. A few years later, in 1978, Maeve Brennan confronted him about the future of their romance. Larkin's response was curt. It had no future.
I don't know why it ended so abruptly, but perhaps he was looking for an excuse to terminate the relationship because he felt, Monica was going to become more dependent on him. This is what he said to me by way of explanation. But of course I didn't know about his relationship with Betty at the time. I don't think he hurt women deliberately at all. I think he just got himself into a mess and couldn't help himself and didn't know how to extricate himself from this entanglement of relationships he had towards the end of his life.
Morning at last. There in the snow, your small blunt footprints come and go. Night has left no more to show. Not the candle, half-drunk wine, nor touching joy. Only this sign of your life walking into mine. But when they vanish with the rain, what morning woke to will remain, whether as happiness or pain.
He did love Maeve, but he took the easy way out there. He knew that Maeve would survive if he broke it off, whereas Monica wouldn't. But he never really let her go. I mean, he saw her every day. He went into her room at the end of the library day and discussed what was happening and what they were doing and so on. So he never really let anybody go.
Philip was also unhappy at home. He'd been forced to move out of his private sanctuary high above Pearson Park. Almost without thinking, he bought what he later called a drab suburban house in Hull's Newland Park district. The house was bigger than he was used to. Monica Jones had recently fallen ill, and then the unthinkable happened. She moved in. His solitary bachelor days were over. They were now living as a couple.
And in a way, he was happy about it, because he was incredibly lonely. And like a lot of people who were addicts of one kind or another, in the end, those people gravitate not towards the person they find most interesting, but towards the person who can absorb as much as they can of the same killer quantity. The fact was, she was a boozer on a heroic scale. Never known a woman who could drink so much. I mean, most women collapse if they drink a whole bottle of gin. She could easily drink a whole bottle of gin. They went in for these appalling drinking sessions, which took sherry at the first thing in the morning and then gin for lunch and then moving on to the cheapest possible whiskey. Philip could get through a whole bottle of that stuff in the evening. And, of course, the drunker they both got, the more wildly extreme and sort of Nazi, basically, their views became.
Prison horse strikers, bring back that cat, kick out the niggers, what about that? Niggers, niggers, kick out the niggers, lock up the commies, God save the Queen. Oh, lock up the, lock up the, lock up the, lock up the, lock up the commies, God save the Queen.
If one goes through the racism, well, one can see that there are things that a man born in 1922 in the Midlands could and did say in a way that's unthinkable in the early 21st century. But Larkin, among other things, was a person of his times.
Looking back, I realise, of course, he was, in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, he was a very sick man. But I can remember once making some Pollyanna-ish, cheer-up Philip type remark late in the evening when we were probably both drunk, and he really replied violently towards me. I mean, I hate being fat, I'm tall, I'm deaf, I've got a stammer, I hate it all. And he did. I mean, he was increasingly miserable.
The great sadness of the last part of his life was that he wasn't writing poems anymore, that this visionary gleam had been dimmed by one thing or another. I mean, he describes it somewhere as a sorrow, but not a crushing sorrow, but actually I think that's rather understating it. I think it was such a blow to his idea of himself and to his idea of what he was put on the earth to do, that it did diminish his pleasure in life a great deal.
Larkin's last years were full of disappointments. He was honoured with degrees and awards, but had to turn down the biggest, Poet Laureate, because he knew his poetry days were behind him. His health was fading. In his last letter to his old friend Kingsley Amis, he wrote, "I simply cannot imagine resuming normal life again, whatever that is." Cancer, which had started in his esophagus, was spreading through his body.
He both looked forward to and dreaded death. He thought the moment of death would be like orgasm. I remember him saying that. But he certainly knew he was staring into nothingness, which is what terrified him so much. It was going to be the loneliness of his own life made infinite, as it were.
Oh, world, your loves, your chances are beyond the stretch of any hand from here. And so, unreal, a touching dream to which we all are lulled, but wake from separately. In it, conceits and self-protecting ignorance congeal to carry life, collapsing only when called to these corridors, for now once more the nurse beckons. Each gets up and goes at last. Some will be out by lunch or 4. Others, not knowing it, have come to join the unseen congregations whose white rows lie set apart above. Women, men, old, young, crude facets of the only coin this place accepts. All know they are going to die. Not yet, perhaps not here, but in the end, and somewhere like this.
Philip Larkin died in the Nuffield Hospital on November the 30th, 1985. He was poetic about mortality right up to the end. His last words to the nurse by his side were, "I am going to the inevitable."
Life is first boredom, then fear. Whether or not we use it, it goes, and leaves what something hidden from us chose, and age, and then the only end of age.
Sadly, Maeve Brennan died shortly after this programme was completed. For more on the life, love and labours of Philip Larkin, visit our website at channel4.com/culture.